Greetings fellow Warhammer enjoyers. Today I'm attempting something I have never done before and hopefully something that can be enjoyed by others as much as I enjoyed working on it. From my introduction to the grim darkness of the far future, I was always drawn to the Salamanders. Like many, my first impression was of a chapter that used fire to the point of absurdity, and for a pyromaniac that sounded perfect. When I started learning more about them, I realized how broad their themes were. Unlike many other sub-factions, they do not stick to a single core. The Dark Angels are secretive and hunt for the fallen, and the Blood Angels have the Red Thirst and the Black Rage. Much of their themes center around those aspects of them. While I am not well-versed in all chapters or trait religions, I always felt like the Salamanders stood out from the rest as a chapter that had few unique aspects. On the surface, all their standout traits seem to be shared with other Space Marines. They are described as hard to break, a description that can fit on many chapters. They are artisans and craftsmen, but it never seems to stretch further than a unique description of their armor. And their black skin and red eyes, on the topic of descriptions, are often just a throwaway line about looking intimidating. Even though their humanity should be the biggest thing that stands out for them, it is what they are known for after all, it is often pushed aside in their own stories to focus on telling something else. When going deeper, you can find themes that seem to move in different directions. The through line of the 40k Omnibus is focused on the struggle to remain human when elevated so far above what that title even means. The themes of 30k is much more focused on not giving up despite no chance of success, while their humanity once again pushed aside to tell another story. In the middle you can find struggles between their genetic trait of self-sacrifice and the lessons taught by Vulkan, the ones that teach self-restraint and self-reliance, the later part of which is rarely touched on considering the implications. You can also see the small mentions of seeking glory but putting it aside for the greater good, a common arc for a supporting character that finally finds his role within the chapter where he can do the most good. And finally, there is the belief in the Circle of Fire, and the adherence to the Promethean Creed, the Salamander's own faith and culture. If there is anything that shows us what the Salamanders are at their core, it is this last theme. A character trait that is brought up many times over their stories, with shorter mentions of what it means in earnest. Yet this also lacks a true focus, and is simply often used as a device to explain their decisions. A shame in my opinion, when it is the core of the chapter that deserves to be as prevalent as the Black Rage and Blood Angels, or the Hunt for the Fallen from Dark Angels. Today I want to focus on the story that shows us the true potential of the Circle of Fire, and how it makes Salamanders different from all other chapters. I want to focus on Deathfire, written by Nick Kine. Deathfire focuses on the small group of Salamanders that managed to gather on Macragge after the betrayal at Istvan. Their leader, Artelis Numion, who is convinced that Vulkan lives despite all evidence that the Primarch died permanently in a previous book. Much of this belief originates from the previous book in the trilogy, Vulkan Lives, written by Nick Kine, where Numion escapes Istvan, attempts to survive and stop a Wordbearer's plot, and is finally captured and taken by the Wordbearers as his attempts fail. During this time, from a mix of denial after seeing Vulkan supposedly dying on Istvan, shame brought about from his duty to protect the Primarch and failing to do so, and the need to believe in something to anchor his determination, Numion convinces himself that Vulkan lives. He brings a small piece of Vulkan's armor with him at all times, a small hammer later known as Vulkan's sigil, and despite his companions telling him it is nothing but scrap, he feels a presence when holding it. His belief becomes an obsession, the only thing driving him forward. During this time, Vulkan is in fact alive and captive, escaping to Macragge at the end of the book, only for him to be assassinated there. The book also introduces Vulkan as an Eternal, him being immortal. The Pyre, as the 66 surviving Salamanders decide to call themselves, attempt to return Vulkan to Nocturne through the Ruin Storm. Now that we know roughly where we begin, I want to focus on a few moments from Deathfire that start to push Numion forward, and that threaten to undo his faith. At the end I will gather it all, and show you how the Promethean Creed can be used when it is the focus of a story. After being rescued from the Wordbearers, Numion is brought to Macragge by the Ultramarines. The reason he is rescued turns out to be Vulkan's sigil, the hammer sending out a beacon in the void. Upon further inspection, this seems to be impossible, because the hammer has no ability to do so. While this at first confirms Numion's belief, it is crushed when he learns that Vulkan is in fact dead. After a short period of denial, because the body disappears and seems to have wandered around, he must finally accept the truth that Vulkan is dead. Here Numion is broken, taking out his anger on his brothers who do not believe as he does, and even going so far as to insult Guilliman himself. When on the brink of losing hope, he learns of a rumor. Vulkan had died falling through Macragge's atmosphere, but regenerated from nothing but charred remains. Numion now gives the first of many excuses why Vulkan has not come back yet. The fulgurite that was used to kill him has not been removed. If they can do that, Vulkan will live. After declaring his belief and attempting to remove the fulgurite every day for weeks with no success, his brothers try to reason with him. They ask him to take up Vulkan's place as Legion Master, a title he has a right to, and to let their father rest. Numion is once again infuriated by this, but cannot argue that nothing he has tried works. Once again on the brink, he finds another excuse, another desperate way to keep his faith alive. The Circle of Fire tells of rebirth. They must return Vulkan to the fires of Nocturne. The others are hesitant. Returning to Nocturne would require sailing through the Ruin Storm, and that is impossible by all understanding. Numion is their leader, however, and while they need purpose and leadership, Numion instead gives them faith, a mad hope that Vulkan lives. Most do not believe it, seeing the saying as a metaphor. Vulkan lives in his teachings, or Vulkan lives in Numion himself. But despite all this, they decide to return to Nocturne. During their journey, several miracles happen. Numion is immolated and emerges without difficulty where he should have died. A Death Guard Terminator is killed by a single strike from Vulkan's sigil, and demons hesitate when presented by it. Every time Numion shouts Vulkan's name, or declares that Vulkan lives. These events convince more of the Salamanders that Numion is correct, that Vulkan is with them, and that he will return when brought to Mount Deathfire. Others still see it as Vulkan being reborn in Numion and the baptismal fire. In the storm, Magnus the Red appears before Numion, and tells him that the miracles were in fact his doing. The beacon that called the Ultramarines all the way to obliterating a Terminator was not Vulkan. While these revelations at first threatened to undo his faith once again, Numion holds to it, declaring that Magnus is lying to him, trying to sway them from their fate of restoring Vulkan to the Imperium. His desperation is so strong that faith is the only way out. Shortly after Magnus departs, they leave the storm, finally on the other side, and they realize it is not where they wanted to be. They instead exit on the side of Terra, the throne world. Behind the ruined storm, Guilliman and the other Primarchs do not know that Terra still stands, and Rogel Dorn, defender of Terra, is unaware that 3 entire legions are prepared to fight. This presents a choice for the dwindling number of the Pyre. Go to Terra and inform Rogaldorn that many of his brothers still fight, or even return to Ultramar and give the message to Guilliman. Numion declares that neither is an option. They will venture through the storm again, but towards Nocturne. In his mind, fate is testing them, seeing if they can stand true to their purpose. He considers that perhaps this was Magnus once again, trying to keep Vulkan from being revived. He convinces the others that this is their only way forward, and that Vulkan must rise. And so, they abandon their duty to the Imperium in favor of a hopeless errand. Two of Numion's closest brothers still do not believe that Vulkan will rise. One of them sees Numion as Vulkan reborn, and the other claims that his spirit will live forever in the teachings he gave to them. They ask why Numion needs this, why it's worth sacrificing all of his brothers in a suicidal attempt to sail through a warp storm. Numion once again refers to the Circle of Fire and the Promethean Creed, claiming that it is not for him that Vulkan must rise, but for the Legion and the Imperium at large. They argue back that the Circle of Fire is a rebirth of the spirit, that it lives on through others, but nothing that comes back will be the same. True rebirth is spoken of only in myth from the dark times before reason, a time of blood sacrifice and dealings with dark beings. Numion declares that those times have returned with the betrayal of Horus, the demons harassing them through the storm, and that he is willing to sacrifice more than blood to see his father return to them, declaring that the Emperor was wrong in his age of reason. With the final steps of their journey completed, the Pyre reach Nocturne. They lower Vulkan into Mount Deathfire as per tradition, together with the few salamanders who had remained on Nocturne. The steps completed, and Numion waits with the others. His belief now confronted with truth. Vulkan does not return. Stricken with despair, Numion ventures into the desert, headed for the mountain. As he walks, his faith once again on the brink, he finds one last excuse why it has not worked, the last piece that is missing. Climbing the mountain as it erupts, Numion finds a crack into its heart where Vulkan was laid to rest. Crawling inside and swallowed by the earth, Numion gives his life in sacrifice to ensure that Vulkan lives. The events are simplified, and many things happen in between. But in my opinion, they are the most important when discussing the Circle of Fire. What we can gather from them is the story of how a man's denial and hope turns into desperation, then followed by a blind dedication to a single belief, heedless of any evidence to the contrary. We see all the parts of the Salamander's personality coming together perfectly to cause this near madness. The stubbornness they are known for that causes Numion to refuse to even consider he is wrong, the willpower they always show, allows him to keep his faith alive despite it all. The pragmatism and self-reliance lets him come up with new methods to attempt, convinced that he alone can find the way. And at its heart is the Circle of Fire, their doctrine turned religion, now that the world itself returns to a time of madness and superstition. Numion, in this story, lets his desperation twist the Circle of Fire into a cult, and convinces the Pyre to follow him. When they reach Nocturne, the salamanders there are shocked by this belief and madness that Vulkan can return. If we move from 30k to 40k, we see this belief in Vulkan's return echoed in the hunt for artifacts. When all 9 are found, Vulkan will join his sons once more. The cult started over 10,000 years ago still influences the salamanders. This is what I would like to see more from them. The struggle to remain pragmatic and focused on their unending mission to protect humanity, while at the same time hunting for vague prophecies in the Tome of Fire, chasing a mythic figure dead to them for millennia. Imagine the schism that could form from such a split focus. The same unfocused goals I mentioned earlier that prevent them from standing out could be turned into something that makes them burn brighter.